If you haven't had the talk with your parents, you're likely setting yourself up for some regrets in the future. I read a quote the other day that said, regret is a form of punishment itself, which in this case is true. Not having a good handle on finances and things for your parents could potentially be a really difficult situation if and when you get pushed into that decision-making role for your parents down the road. And it can be really stressful. Money tends to be a really sensitive topic and something that most people avoid discussing. It's generally considered not polite and just really controversial to bring up. But when it comes to adult children and aging parents, it's a conversation that simply needs to happen. Failing to talk about the financial and the legal matters with your parents can put you in a really difficult position if you ever need to take over those decisions entirely. My name is Amber Knips. I'm a wealth advisor at Sweet Financial Partners in Fairmont and Jackson, Minnesota. And I specialize in working with high net worth individuals as they navigate life's biggest transition, both expected and unexpected. We believe everyone has the right to realize that their dreams are possible. And that's what we use as the focus for everything that we do when helping clients plan for their future. I was having a conversation with someone the other day whose parents are in their 80s, and unfortunately their health and their cognitive awareness has really started to decline fast. And it's amazing how often that happens when both seem to kind of start to decline together. Maybe one took care of the other, and you just didn't quite notice how fast things changed. Well, for them, bills were coming in, they were missing things, missing making payments. So the kids had to step in. And it was really difficult. They didn't have a handle on things, where everything was at. And they were basically just waiting for statements and things to come in the mail, which isn't a good strategy. That's being reactive to the situation instead of being proactive, which is really important to avoid. And recently I did another video really similar to this that goes into detail preparing for all of life's transitions and what ifs, as that's something that I specialize in and I'm passionate about. So trying to get things as organized as possible, especially for the things that don't initially come to mind. So I would recommend that you watch that video, as it's going to help you as you navigate this conversation with your parents, as well as getting things coordinated for yourself. And if you're on the fence about whether you even want to have this potentially a little awkward conversation, something really important to consider is that it's likely going to happen sooner than later. So you're either going to have to plan by crisis or, do it by a plan and knowing how things could potentially go. So unfortunately, these are things that happen and are going to come up, and you don't want to be pushed into a situation where you're having to make really quick decisions. Instead, having this conversation with your parents when they're mentally alert, they're in good health, and it's not an emotional conversation or emotional decisions because a crisis has struck. So this is why I want to go through 7 tips for discussing money and finances with aging parents to at least start the conversation. So my first tip, and probably most important, is check your feelings and opinions at the door. And what I mean by that is you need to set aside what you feel like they should be doing or shouldn't be doing and let them focus on doing most of the talking. Making them feel like they're being talked at or pushed into things is likely going to cause them to close up and be not very receptive to the conversation. Finances tend to be a taboo topic, and it might be hard for them to open up. So being really cautious about how you have that conversation is really important, because it's likely your motivation for asking these questions about your parents' financial situation, estate plan, comes from genuine concern. And it's not something that you want them to feel like, oh, I'm only being greedy or being disrespectful, talking about some of those things. And potentially how the conversation is worded, or if it's not very timely to have that conversation, it can cause them to clam up and make that decision to have that conversation really difficult. So financial talk with your parents doesn't have to be awkward, and it doesn't have to be a one-time conversation. Ideally it's one you gradually get them more comfortable so they can see what your goal is and get you both peace of mind. And the second is keep some topics off limits. and always being respectful of your parents' privacy and independence, and make sure that your questions and your comments as you go along, they're appropriate. Don't ask things that maybe seem a little insensitive, or maybe jump right into it like, hey, how much retirement savings do you have? But that might make them feel like you only care about the dollar amount. You're wondering what you're going to inherit one day, which isn't the case. Your parents' money, ultimately, they can spend it how they please. And, there unfortunately is a strong likelihood that they'll need a chunk of it, if not all, for some care down the road. So regardless of how you feel, their wealth should get distributed, it's their decision. And it's important to not push them, even if you feel strongly one way or the other. And another thing to keep in mind is that they might feel embarrassed. So they might be embarrassed by their situation, and they might not be comfortable talking about money, especially in detail. So being able to have that conversation delicately is really important. And you don't need to know the ins and the outs right away, but just having an idea of what they put in place is a really great place to start, and know that they've done the proper planning, because the conversation can always continue as the comfort grows, which is a really great lead in to the next tip: keep them in control. So talk to your parents, about how you just want to continue on the path of what they've created for themselves. And maybe that means staying at home as long as possible because that's where they're most comfortable. So having them know that you have good intentions is really important, and that you want their wishes to be respected, both in life and in death. And that you just need a really good understanding of what their preferences are, so that you can make sure that you follow that. And it's possible that maybe your parents are nervous about losing that independence. They've always been that safe and secure role, especially as a parent, and shifting that can be really scary. So letting them know you're committed to helping them continue with their wishes will be really reassuring, and that'll help it be a positive conversation. And, this is a great one too, of having the whole family be part of the conversation too, because family dynamics can be interesting. And we've seen a lot of that you don't want one sibling to feel like you're maybe overstepping your bounds. So letting everyone be part of that conversation too can be a really great step, and letting them know maybe what would happen if you don't have this conversation, and talk about some of the negatives that eventually it could mean a non-family member making some of their decisions for them, which could be worst case scenario. And number 4, don't make the conversation about money. So if your parents, you've gotten that vibe in the past that money is a taboo topic, you're likely not going to get them to open up if you just ask them right away about how much money they have, who do they invest with, what exactly that looks like. So instead, talk about big picture topics. So for example, you could say, hey mom, hey dad, have you given much thought of, what retirement ultimately always looks for you? And what does that look like? What do you want to accomplish? And that'll get them thinking and hopefully talking. And, some of their answers will give you clues to, maybe what they've done, what they haven't done, and lifestyle. So if they say, gosh, I really would love to travel, but that's not in the cards for me, then you could respond by saying, well, what do you mean? Why don't you think you'll be able to travel? And then if they say, well, it's too expensive, we can't afford it, then you can go through and give them maybe some ideas on how to be more cost effective with travel, and help them find ways to meet it in their budget. And maybe that's a good way for them to kind of provide some more insight onto their finances, as they can see you're just coming from a helpful place. And ultimately, you're achieving 2 things. They get to travel, which is really important to them, and you get to learn a little bit more so you can help them too down the road. And another way too is to approach the conversation of, saying, what are their wishes? So what do you want to make sure happens at the end of your life? And I love this conversation because it helps them see that you want to make sure everything happens the way that it should. And maybe that's things like end of life care, or staying home as long as possible, or, how their assets get split up. You could say something like, mom and dad, you took such good care of me when I was younger. I want to provide that for you. I want to make sure that you're taken care of in the way that you should be, if you ever need it. And this is a great way to ease into that conversation about, do you have a will? Do you have a living will? Any power of attorney documents? Have you done any long-term care planning? And really get that conversation going too. And if they haven't, and they're like, what are you talking about? What's a will? That might be a good opportunity to think about that a little bit further too, and maybe insert that into the conversation. And number 5, ask for advice. So some parents might be reluctant to have that money conversation with their kids because it's that role reversal. And if you suspect that might be the conversation with your parents, maybe you could start by saying, I need some advice on saving for retirement. What did you do? Or how much life insurance do you think I need? And really getting that conversation going, because we all know parents never stop being parents, no matter how old you are. So having that conversation allows them to do what parents do best, give advice, whether you want it or not, but have them give that advice so that they can open up about some of those things. And often that's a really great way for them to say, well, here's what we did, and here's what we did and why, and get them opening up about that. And, for example, they might say, well, we didn't have a big need for, XYZ because we had a pension. And that was a great way for us to have income in retirement. And then you can turn around and say, wow, that's great. I bet that was a great steady income stream. Did you have to do anything else? Or do you have anything else to supplement? And using those as ways to feed off of the information that they gave to you. And, looking at that too of estate planning and saying, well, how do you determine the best way to split up assets? I'm struggling with that with my kids. How should I do that? Or how do you think I could do that? Could be a really great way to get into that. And number 6, I love this one, is use a story, because we all love a good story, right? That's why we spend countless hours either watching Netflix, maybe Yellowstone, or reading books, our favorite authors, because we love a good story and it's something we can relate to. So stories are a great way to get that conversation going, especially about finances. Maybe you tell them about a friend whose father died without a will, and their parents had to, go through a whole different thing because they didn't have things set up properly. And there was, court and, having all these different issues. So that could be a great way to see if they've done any estate planning as well as getting them thinking about how important that is, because it could cause a whole slew of issues. Or maybe it's saying, gosh, I had a coworker whose mother had a stroke and she couldn't make any of her own financial decisions. And then they couldn't get access to pay any bills or anything like that because she didn't have power of attorney. So having the conversation of, should we put that in place now? Like, we don't want to take that decision from you, but we want to be able to step in if needed. And, even talking about creating a list of all the financial assets, passwords and things like that can be a really good thing to do too. Another really good one to start mentioning too is telling a story about someone who is a victim of a scam, because unfortunately that's becoming even more common. There's so many times that we hear, gosh, this happened in my email, or I got a call from this person, and they're thinking of even more clever ways to take advantage of people, which is terrible, but you want to make sure they're protected, because we all think, well, gosh, that'll never happen to me. I'll be fully aware, I'm not going to fall into those things, but you just never know. So thinking through some of those things and telling some of those stories can be really good. And if you don't have a story of your own, ask your financial advisor, send me a message. I'd love to share some of the stories that I have and use some of those experiences that we've come across as a great way to learn from other people's unfortunate, situations and mistakes, to be as proactive as possible. And the last one, number 7, is walk through what if scenarios. And anyone that knows me, I love what if scenarios of if this, what if that, because I want to try and think through all of the things and get as many things prepared for as possible. And one of the most important things to talk through with your parents is what happens in the case of an emergency. We can't be prepared for everything, unexpected things happen, but setting that framework of how to deal with those different things is really important. So starting the conversation of, well, what if this, in this scenario, how would you want me to handle that? Can lead to a more in-depth conversation. Some example of this would be, what if there was a car accident and, some really quick medical decisions had to be made? Who would you want to make that decision? And is there a specific decision you'd potentially want to be made? So setting up some of those things could be important to meet with an attorney and talk through that a little bit more. Also it could be simple as, well, what are your wishes? Do you want to be buried or do you want to be cremated? And, that's something that seems, like, oh, we'll deal with that down the road. But I can't tell you how many times I've had families torn apart because everybody feels a little bit differently on that stuff. And a lot of the time, it's not the finances that tears families apart. It's the emotional part of it. And being able to take that away is such an important gift to give to your family, to say, well, here's XYZ what I want done. Maybe you don't agree with it, and that's fine. They're my wishes. Then at least everybody knows. So everyone has time to be comfortable with that. So if something pops up, it's not unexpected. It's like, well, now, we know who to reach out to. We know, a lot of the decisions that are to be made, and it makes that just go a lot easier. So like I mentioned before, it's so important to be proactive when it comes to finances and some of these decisions, as our parents get older. So you're not reacting to things as they come up, because that can be really draining. And the biggest thing I want for my clients is to say, I am so glad I knew that. I'm so glad I was prepared for that, versus, oh, I wish I would have known, I would have done things really differently. So I highly encourage you to check out my next video that I've done on preparing for life's what ifs, as it helps you go in more detail on what you can do to be organized now, and some of the things that maybe you've never even thought about to be prepared for if something unexpected happens. And as always, reach out with any questions or help as you navigate these conversations moving forward.